I'm Mark Seifter, and this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone, to our episode on hidden information, secrets, metagaming, GM sleight of hand, and all of the sorts of tricks and tips that we have for running a game where the PCs don't necessarily know the same things as the players, and that sometimes you need to think about what you tell the players in order to make the game a little bit more enjoyable for players who don't like to have sort of metagame spoilers that sort of color their information about what's going on. So, and Kubitz points out you can have hidden information from Hidden Linda. Yes, that's right. So Linda is not going to be joining us today because she's sick, but we're still going to do the episode, and she's in chat along with all the other people in chat, so you'll see me glancing down towards the screen for information on chat, and we'll figure it all out. Alright, so the basic principle of even the reason why this episode exists is that fundamentally you're going to be telling stories with the game where you, the GM, know information that the player characters do not know. You know the plot, you know the secrets, you know what the villain's actually scheming, you know all sorts of details. You know what's in the next room, you know where the treasure is. Whatever you've prepared for the adventure is something that you know and that the player's characters don't know. Now, you could play a game where you actually tell all the players all of that information I just said. However, there's a variety of reasons why you might not want to do that. Most of which is just that most players don't have as much fun if they just know everything that's coming, and there can't be any surprises in the plot, there can't be any surprising encounters, surprising rewards, any surprising twists, and it's the same as if you sort of read to the end of a novel, or you read to the end of or you watched the end of a TV show or a movie before going to the beginning. Ooh, thanks for all of the subscriptions, Author's Tale. That does remind me, it is still September where subscriptions are half off, but we at Arcane Mark still get full value out of them. So it's a great time to subscribe, and we will ping Author's Tale for the extra. Alright. Thanks so much. So fundamentally, just people don't like spoilers, and even if they think that they want a spoiler right now, often they would enjoy the story a little bit more if they didn't just know everything that was going to happen, and they could speculate, they could theorize, they could sort of try to figure it out and enjoy the sort of exhilaration of discovery. So that is ultimately why we're going to look at secrets, hidden information, and metagaming, and little sleight of hand tricks that you can pull. It's not about saying us, take that to the players. It's not about trying to sort of be mean to the players. It's more about providing an experience that the players will enjoy, and a narrative that allows for surprise and various different sort of emotional reactions to the unexpected. Alright. So, that being said, metagaming is part of our discussion. And metagaming is something that we pretty much always do all the time. Metagaming is something that often has a really big stigma because of the fact that we talk about metagaming when what we mean is seriously problematic metagaming, where you use metagame information to illogically have the character act to the advantage of, to the perceived advantage of the player's self-interest. But really, almost everything we do in the game, other than super deep method acting, gets into some amount of metagaming and understanding that this is a game. Like, every time that your PCs, one of the PCs dies, and then you decide to accept that new PC that the same player made into the group without too much of a fuss, without the same fuss that you made all of those times the NPCs tried to join the group, that's metagaming. And sometimes metagaming can be important, and it can be very, sort of very pro-social for the game. But until then, you basically are winding up with metagaming that... basically metagaming is a larger concept, and we are trying here to talk about the ways that you as the GM can think about metagaming and can make decisions that will help just sort of protect your players from anything from metagaming that they might not even want to do, but that they will unconsciously do. Like, if you tell a player point blank, when they see a new monster that they've never seen before, hey, this monster's resistant to fire, you could have the best player in the world. I mean, it's not about the player being bad or good as a person or as a player. They're going to wind up metagaming. If they decide to attack it with fire anyway, that's actually still possibly metagaming where they're like, well, the GM just told me that, so I can't, I better attack it with fire, otherwise, otherwise I'm acting on out-of-game information. But that itself is acting on out-of-game information. You almost can't avoid some degree of metagaming if you have metagame information. Even if you're trying to use it to keep more to your character. If you see what I mean. You could call that metagaming there, and it is an infinite rabbit hole of metagaming. If you say, oh yeah, now I'll never attack it with fire, that's the more classic term of metagaming that people think of when they're talking about it. So Linda suggests that that we also talk about changing familiar details. What's the line between subverting expectations in an interesting way and then undermining the sense of world consistency? So that's a very important point, Linda. When you are trying to establish world consistency, it's really, really important that you overall keep the details of what's true and what's real in your world consistent based on the previous ways that you've explained it in the past. So if you've decided that, for example, you know what the sectors of your city are, you want to keep that consistent. If you've decided that you have an evil devil-worshipping empire like Cheliax and how they interact on a political scale, you'll want to keep it consistent, unless there's a reason in world why it would change. And so basically, I guess what I'm saying here is that players will just lose all sense of consistency and what makes sense if everything is constantly changing, if everything is constantly being subverted. So you want them to be able to predict what happens in the world as if the world had an internal logic or sense of its own. It doesn't have to be the same as our world. It might not follow things that you would call fully simulationist, but at least it has to make a sort of cause and effect sense, and it has to have continuity from where you started before. And that I would say that's a very related topic to secrets and metagaming and sleight of hand, but it's not exactly the same topic, but it's an important thing to note. And Katsune Warlock points out in the first world, all the rules change at the whims of the eldest. So that's very true. If you're on the first world, then it makes sense that the world changes at the whims of the eldest, though. And you find out, oh yeah, I'm in the role of this eldest, of course the world changed that way. And then it does make a sense in the narrative and in the world. So that is something that could work. Linda also suggests that you can change the monster's descriptions and powers, and that's something you absolutely can do. And something that we, honestly, that Jason, who you guys said is in here from when Author's Tale did the subscriptions, did a great job with some of the monsters in the bestiary, adding just a bunch of variant abilities in 2nd edition that you can just say, oh yeah, my skeleton's got one of these. even if your player has memorized all of the skeleton rules in there, they don't know which one you picked, or zombie rules, or any of the other variant undead, where he came up with rules like that for them. So similarly, that's even one where you're not even pulling the rug out from someone who knows a lot of information about the creatures, because you are using something that was in the book, but it even says it's only going to be one out of all those powers. Monster descriptions, where you sort of use a different sort of depiction of a monster with similar abilities, can be a good way to help players avoid their metagaming. Like if you fight a blue flying, or even I guess flying would change its powers. So even just you fight like a blue cat-like creature that has all the abilities of a troll, like claws and rend and regeneration, but it's a troll. It'll take your players a little while to figure out that it is going to regenerate unless they use fire or acid. Whereas if you describe exactly a troll and show a picture of the troll, they can do their best not to metagame, but they probably know what it is if they're experienced Pathfinder players and they've seen that depiction of a troll before. Linda points out it's closely tied because an easy pitfall to drop into when trying to avoid metagaming is undermining world consistency to try to subvert expectations or counter metagame actions even more. That's where something like I've read online about like some comic authors or TV series like lead authors who will sometimes basically say that they listen to what fans are saying and they don't like to be predicted. So if too many people are predicting a certain plot twist or a certain plot device that's being used, that they'll just change it to something else, even if they've laid a lot of foreshadowing towards that thing. And I can see that as a problem as well in the way that Linda describes, because, well, the rug is kind of pulled out from under that foreshadowing just to make it not the thing that people were predicting, just to make it not predictable. In some senses, plots and stories have predictable elements that we recognize from tropes or from other stories that have been told before, because ultimately, while we don't want it to be metagame where you just tell the players at the beginning everything or they know everything, having a familiar story click into place, that moment of aha, recognizing what's going on and being right about it, that's sort of one of the positive things that you're trying to create. If you're constantly subverting expectations so the players are never correct about anything, that can be just as bad as a table where everybody knows all the information ahead of time and there's no surprises. So it's very important to keep in mind that everything I'm going to say here about hidden information, it can be taken too far. Certainly there are a lot of groups where you have enough trouble getting the players to remember the non-hidden information about the world that you want to make sure that they remember and they know consistently, let alone hidden information. You can hide it just by telling them and not reminding them 5 times. So to that extent, you need to gauge and know your group and use some of these tools sort of with a grain of salt. Use some of these tools based on when you need to. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's move into talking about secrets and hidden information. So fundamentally, a lot of the time when secrets and hidden information come up in play are when the players want to have their characters do something, or and they sort of don't know how well their character did. You'll see it with secret checks in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, for example. The player tries to find information, or they're sneaking around, and they don't necessarily immediately know whether or not they got spotted, and the enemy is sort of secretly signaling that they found the character. And I mean, sometimes when you sneak, it'll be obvious, because they'll shout, "Hey, look! It's a sneaking rogue!" But if the enemies are going to play it cool and pretend they didn't see you, and then actually, as soon as you're gone, raise the alarm quietly or get an ambush ready, that's going to be different. Whereas if you have information that's wrong about something, then you might act in a certain way on that misinformation. In a very real sense, just the fact that the world of Pathfinder allows you to have information that could be wrong makes learning information and trying to find out more in the world much more interesting. Because of the fact that you have to say, when you find out something that sounds pretty unbelievable, you have to say, well, Ezra knows a lot about magic. I kind of trust him on anything arcane, but on the other hand, that thing that he just said is pretty outlandish. Maybe he was wrong. Whereas if you're playing with no secret information, or even just with the idea that Ezra can't be wrong, and you either don't know anything or what you know is always right, then you've kind of taken away that possible conversation, that story beat, or that situation between the PCs. Especially great when PCs have different opinions about what's true because they rolled secretly in a different way. You might think that Valeros is wrong about magic and Ezrin is right, and most of the time you'd be right, but it could be funny if one time Valeros got a natural 19 and Ezrin got a natural 2, and Valeros actually knew it from his occultism from the time that he spent in the Boneyard after all of his, in the comics, if you remember, he died and he went to the Boneyard and spent some time there, and I think he trained a bit in occultism. And he comes back and he's like, oh yeah, I've got this. This is what it is. And Ezrin is like, no. And if Valeros is right, it just can be hilarious later on, because probably Mauricio and Kyra and the others are gonna side with Ezrin on that. Alright. So, Linda is talking about if you're running a game and the player says, oh, that's a troll, use fire, and the PCs don't know that at all, when and how do you address that? So that's a good question. Really, it depends on your group. For some groups, maybe you're fine with that. Maybe you've just decided trolls are really, 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 really super duper common, and everybody knows to use fire. Just when you grow up, there are nursery rhymes that are like, the troll looks upon you, and what do you do? With fire and acid and something, with fire and acid we spit on you, or so. You have some kind of little nursery rhyme about trolls, and you assume everyone knows it, even if they live in terrains where there are no trolls. There are a lot of ways you can handle it. If you want to use recall knowledge as a way to deal with it, then you would possibly say to the player, well, hold on, does your character know that? Maybe try to use a recall knowledge to find out. Elftro points out in the audio drama, Valeros starts reading Thessalonians, and the others are like, what? You can read Thessalonian? So, basically, there are a lot of ways to do it. You probably shouldn't be super accusatory, though. You shouldn't, go in and be like, oh, they're like, oh, that's a troll, use fire, and you're like, that is just the most blatant metagaming I've ever seen in my entire life. I can't believe that you would do something like that. What kind of a role player are you? Don't do that, no matter what. That's never the right answer. There's no reason to confront someone or try to shame them or otherwise use negativity. Instead, just sort of think about how you can frame it constructively, or just decide, yeah, maybe everyone knows about trolls, that's cool. Linda says, how dare you cheat at my sacred table experience? So, basically, you know what's right for your group. I would posit that for almost no groups is it right that, knowing a laundry list of 10 special immunities and resistances and weaknesses of a unique monster that's only in that adventure would make any sense for anybody to have without a recall knowledge check. It's there's not nursery rhymes about this one unique monster that has its own unique set of stats that only exists here and is not like any other monster in the game. There's no way you could convince me that it would be reasonable for your character to just automatically have that information at hand and be able to identify the creature without making some kind of a recall knowledge to piece it together. But maybe in your game, you do. It really is up to you how you use it, because remember, the idea behind these secrets and the idea behind this hidden information is ultimately that it's all to make the game more enjoyable for the players and to give them that aha moment, to give them that sense that it's not just some rote information that they all had ahead of time, and that there's some secrets and mystery in the game. And that's what you should try to use hidden information for. That can be things that will delight them when they find it, like treasure, things that might make them groan, like a hidden ambush, things that are unexpected. There's not too much need to hide information that actually would kind of be fun for the PCs to have. So part of this episode is making sure you think about whether or not you need to hide certain information from the PCs. For example, the backstory of a dungeon that doesn't make it like easier or less exciting to go there. Just you sort of know how it was built, why it's there, and why certain background effects are there. That could be something that's fun. Find a way to insert that in, just to get the PCs interested. Like at least one adventure had like a Thessalonian library that was just being curated down underground somewhere. And there's a lot of backstory to it, and it wouldn't necessarily make it more of less of a surprise or less interesting. And so I believe that adventure sort of like added a ghostly curator who sort of describes things to you, and that's a great way to get that information across. So whenever you find that added flavor, Kitsune Warlock points out Pathfinder Society like always has a few paragraphs of that for each adventure at the beginning. Finding a way to convey that to the players enriches the game. There's no need to hide that, and there's not really a good reason to. So think about what you're hiding and whether or not the hidden information is enriching the game for when it eventually is revealed. Think about whether or not actually revealing the information right away would be better. Background information, world information, any of the kinds of things that you think about and you kind of want the players to buy into are things that you should try to make sure that you get across to the players. Whereas hidden information should be pieces of information where you are kind of hoping that there might be some secrets, there's some discovery, or to give a sense of the players using their skills and using their knowledge to move forward and to figure out what's going on. Linda says sometimes it can be fun when you know your character is woefully misinformed, depending on the player. That's absolutely true. It really depends on the players and their characters. Some people really have a lot of fun, especially if they think of sort of the dice and the game as a way to help role-playing and improvisation. But a lot of players really want to win. And so they feel like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place when they get information they know is wrong, because they can lean into it and really role play it up. But if they follow it, they know that it's going to be making them more likely to lose. And it really depends on sort of the way your group works and group dynamic and just the different players in your group. You might have the person who likes playing into being misinformed and doesn't mind about that, but someone else who really wants to win, who is just always going to ignore that false information. So maybe it might be okay to let the player who just wants to know what's wrong and really play into it roll their own checks secretly and let the GM know, and then don't tell any of the other players, for example. It really absolutely can depend on your group. Oh yeah, Nitrace, thanks so much for subscribing. Oh, it's totally fine to miss streams. We'll have them up on YouTube eventually. Kitsune Warlock says about, Red Dragons hate fire. It's why they spit it out. It's toxic to them. I had one in a demo for during the playtest where Valoros was convinced that if you use slashing attacks on zombies, it would split them in half, and then you get attacked by both halves of the zombie. And so he told Amiri, come on, don't use your slashing attack, that's going to happen. And Amiri's like, tough, it's a bastard sword, that's all I've got. And she hit the zombie for like 20 damage or some huge amount of damage. And Valor was like, does it split in half? And I said, well, no, it just dies from 20 damage. And Amiri said, see, you're wrong. And Valor said, no, it still would split in half, but if you hit it that hard, sure, okay, that just killed it. But don't do a little attack with slashing damage. And it was just a really fun back and forth between them. It was totally a critical failure. As you guys know about zombies, they're actually weak to slashing, and it would have been a good idea. Elftro talks about experience of role-playing less knowledge with GMing when you talk to an NPC who has no idea what's going on. And yeah, that absolutely is true that GMs have to be able to compartmentalize that knowledge. It's very, very important. Hidden Twig says in Mosquito Witch, the second adventure for Pathfinder Society in 2nd edition, you can tell whether the players paid attention and which ones didn't due to the events that happened. Something that is a struggle with Society play because everyone shows up with different levels of commitments. That is a pretty good and interesting point. Mosquito Witch is pretty cool, and Eleanor, I think, did a great job with that adventure, as did the organized play team with developing it. It's one that is near and dear to my heart as a fan of certain TV shows that sort of I feel like have the vibe as a child, that have the vibe from Mosquito Witch. So it looks like there's a lot more conversation on the chat about Mosquito Witch. Very cool. So ultimately, when it comes to secrets, we talked about like just flat out secret checks. It can be helpful to have your players' information ahead of time, just have them send you what their bonuses are, so that you're not like, alright, you go into the room. Hey, Bob, what's your will save modifier? Bob's like, why? No reason. So, if you don't have it, you might want to ask for certain modifiers for actually no reason. That's part of GM's sleight of hand. GM's sleight of hand is when you sort of do things that are meant to throw off metagaming, not to be a gotcha on metagamers, but to mostly help players who legitimately don't want to metagame but sort of can't help it when you throw Chekhov guns at them, by following the old story of the leprechaun and his gold. There's a story of someone who caught a leprechaun back when the legend of the leprechaun is if you catch them, they have to tell you where their gold is. And he forced the leprechaun to take him to the tree where the gold was buried. But that he found out that it was buried way underground at the tree. The leprechaun had led him to believe it was just going to be right there. He needed a shovel and a lot of tools to get to the gold. So in order to do that, he put a ribbon on the tree so he would be sure to know where the tree was. And he told the leprechaun as part of letting him go, okay, I'm going to let you go. I obviously can't just carry you back to my shovel, but before you do, you must swear not to remove the ribbon from the tree. And the leprechaun agreed, and the man came back, and he found that every tree in the forest had a ribbon on it. So, similarly, you can remove Chekhov's guns from the equation, and to explain, Chekhov's gun is sort of a device, sort of plot device determined by Anton Chekhov about if a gun appears in Act 1 of a play, it's going to be fired by the end of the play. And it's the idea of something really conspicuous that you give attention to detail to is there for a reason, most likely, and it's going to wind up being important later on. But this can also be you can also use that same principle for Chekhov's will save modifier or any other kind of thing like that. Usually the GM asks for something for a reason. If you obscure it by doing things for no reason sometimes, you can actually help build uncertainty about that. So Dark Swordsman asks, how do you deal with players who purposefully metagame or accidentally end up with knowledge about a published campaign? I assume he means a published campaign, because otherwise you probably couldn't accidentally end up with knowledge about the campaign. So, that case, it's very difficult. You're going to have to work with that player. Let's say maybe it's just not their own fault. They were going to run that campaign, and they read the whole AP to try to get a handle on it, and then that group fell apart. And they're a member of your friend group, and your friend group really, really, really wants to run that, and you don't want to leave your friend out, but you know they absolutely know the whole campaign. So you can try to ask them to help you handle certain aspects of the campaign, and get them sort of involved a little bit more on the GM side. Like, maybe they're going to handle some NPCs for you too. Maybe they can help you plot a little bit. You could also just make changes from the AP and tell them, hey, just to help you out here, I'm going to make some pretty big changes, so that way you don't have to worry about knowing everything, because some of those NPCs that are supposed to be your friends might betray you. Some of the ones that betray you actually are real friends, and now you can not worry that your information is going to make it just not fun, that you know all the twists and turns. But ultimately, there's no one fit for that, because there's not exactly one given way that a person might come up with more information than you or they were hoping to have. Xtonland says that they've run a lot of online Pathfinder Society, have them fill out a sheet with some of their mods for the exact reason of being able to roll the checks. For recall knowledge at the outset, then whispering the results online, yielding a lot more people acting on false knowledge. Yes, that's a very solid way to do it. I know a lot of the first edition Pathfinder Society scenarios that really were focused on like the sense of uncertainty, mystery, and sometimes horror. Even explicitly asked the GM to gather Will Say's perceptions and a few other things ahead of time. I think Haunting of Hinojai did, perhaps, and a few others as well. Kitsune Warlock says, if your GM is Tolkien and just gives way too much focus to every tree. Yes, if you give too much focus to every tree, that can help. Then you don't have to worry about Chekhov's gun. Linda talks about minis for all statues. That is a story that goes back to something that we had noticed. Actually, I guess a GM at Gen Con first did this, and it just was a really cool idea, so we took it back, which is anytime you go to a really interesting set-piece location, whether or not there's an encounter there, he would have us put our minis on the map, and he would put statues, any of the things that traditionally come to life, sarcophagi, like corpses, other things like that, would always have a mini on there. And that is definitely something that can help, as opposed to just only putting them out when those are the enemies. Because then they'll always know, oh, wow, that's the enemies. Certainly, back in Boston Lodge, Linda did that a few times as well, and we started doing that. I don't know if a lot of people there are doing that now, too. It's something we had picked up at Gen Con. Well, I had one player of a cleric who used, I think, 2 different channel energies on just... There's one adventure that had some corpses that were sort of mummified and left on display by a very evil cult. And there were actually undead in that adventure that the channels would have been very useful for, but he used them on just mummified corpses that were not anything, because I put minis of different little undead minis for where the corpses were on the map. Hidden Twig points out that also makes it so people don't have as clear a sense of safety of where to stand in the room. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's a little bit about sort of keeping... the lack of knowledge can also keep people out of sort of a complacent comfort zone where they're not really as engaged or excited by the game. And just sort of leaves that level of uncertainty that's really engaging and really interesting, and it's like, oh yeah, I don't know where I'm safe. That's particularly important for a mystery or a horror game, but it might be less important for certain genres. Sorry. Hopefully I'm not coming down with what Linda has. I don't think so. But, thanks for blessing me, chat. Hopefully it is a blessing of Sarenrae and not Urgathoa. So, basically a lot of the uses of GM Sleight of Hand, the term I'm using for GM Sleight of Hand is things like we're talking about, putting those statues down on the map that were totally actually not golems. They are just to help players to sort of get behind their character and lose the Chekhov's gun and other fourth wall breaking information and be able to feel that uncertainty again. So basically, those are very handy. There are some situations where, so I'm going to come out here and say, even though, yes, there have been people who are producers for, say, content like comics or TV shows who say that they changed their plots to make it not what everybody guessed. That is a little bit different than a game, because that's something that you're just consuming and the creator is just creating the plot. When it comes to a game, I'm pretty strongly in the camp that you should not change your plot to make it different than what players guessed. But there is the exact opposite, which I will say is sometimes a good idea. Which is, sometimes the players start speculating, and their idea for something that was going on is something that makes total sense, you hadn't thought of, and would enrich your original idea. It's better than just going with the basic idea. So adding in a twist or two or idea that the players had for what might be going on, or at least using it to enrich your story, even if it's not right, just some element of why they thought that was true, becoming part of the plot, because they might identify, like, let's say you decided that the butler killed the person who had died, but that the PCs identified like a very major plot with the dead rich person's son that you had not realized was going to be so interesting. You can definitely, even if you still just think that the butler did it, you could still add some more information and add more to what's going on with the son. Essentially, you could think of when the PCs ask you questions, when the players ask you about something, when they try to roll about it. If you didn't have anything for them to learn, they are indicating their interest and intention in exploring that particular facet of the game. So that means that it might be a good idea to add something into there, even if it's not plot critical, just some wrinkle, because that's something that caught their interest, and that's always going to be able to help. Let's see. Warlock says, Murder on the Throaty Mermaid. The GM was clearly upset that the PC's love triangle theory was more engaging than the plot that was chosen for the murder. Certainly, Murder on the Throaty Mermaid, we've talked about before in this stream, how I managed to have to run it for like a 16-hour game, thanks to my delightful home group players that we were playing with, and their refusal to allow a fast forward. But that's one that's very tricky because of the fact that, as Kitsune Warlock implies, with the plot that GM had chosen for the murder, sort of pretty much anyone can be the culprit, and you have to choose at the beginning of the game who it is, and then a very small number of clues get changed to make that be true, which makes it a lot... that makes it so that someone who's run it before still doesn't know who the culprit is, which is good. But it also makes it so that there aren't a very large number of clues that actually solve the mystery. And that's something that came to bite my players when they ran it for like a million years. Okay, 16 hours, not a million years. But in RPG sessions time, that is a very long session. We certainly had a lot of laughs, a lot of fun, and most of the players' characters in character thought that the Inquisitor did it, the PC Inquisitor, because he was ultra sketchy and had like sneaked away from the group to skulk around. And he really didn't have the right thing to say for himself when he decided to say that the reason he used Create Water, which removed all evidence, was, I needed to make sure he was dead. But I've explained it to you guys before. It's probably in our backlog. I don't even know what episode it's in. So, you guys will... Maybe one of you does and can point it out. Otherwise, and maybe someone who's listening to this at some point will, like, make a comment and be like, oh, it's episode numbers, yada yada. But I don't know which one it is. I know we went into more detail on that, and it's not super into hidden information. Honestly, it was probably the mystery episode. But hidden information is not just about mysteries. It's really about every game you play, and it's about every story you tell. Obviously, not many of them have a huge amount. And like I said before, it's all about what you make secret. If you make everything super secret all the time, and then just don't tell the piece, then it might mean you're not telling the players because they just don't make the check. That's a piece of information they might lose the chance to ever learn that could enrich the story. So keep that in mind, but it is a lot of fun when there's a possibility for uncertainty or wrong information, so keep that in mind too. And generally, when the PCs have wrong information also, it doesn't have to be wrong information that's like totally going to mess them up. It doesn't have to be like, this is carefully determined to make your life miserable if you act on it. It could just be wrong and it's going to lead nowhere. It's just going to lead down a dead end or just not be relevant at all. Like, if you find out that wrong information about trolls that say that, like, basically trolls treat poison like healing potions, so it heals them. Most likely, unless you were planning on using a lot of poisons on the troll, it doesn't really cause them a problem. And even then, like, in reality, trolls have a really high fortitude save, so poison might not have been your best option against them anyway. So, Linda says it could lead to something silly, but ultimately harmless. Yes, that's right. Ultimately, as the GM, it's up to you where it's going to lead, but you generally don't want it to lead down a total rabbit hole that sort of diverts or sort of throws off the entire adventure that you've planned. Sometimes it can be something that really affects the PCs. When Logan was running the very first internal playtest of Doomsday Dawn, Cosmo was playing a bard, a goblin bard who had dubious knowledge, and he failed a check. We didn't know he had failed, and had some information about that dungeon that was totally correct, and another piece of information that said that basically, if you're familiar with it, there's this one encounter that you do right before the end, and then you kind of can rest, and then you do a ritual and do the last encounter. Cosmo's information was that if we killed the second to last encounter, it would summon the final encounter immediately. So that really changed the way we approached the second to last encounter, because we prepared as if we couldn't throw our best stuff because we needed to keep everything in reserve for an even harder encounter afterwards, which made that second to last encounter actually harder than it would have been. And then we found out that that didn't happen, and we actually had as much time as we needed, and it was a laugh, a release of tension, and then we were fine. So I think that was a really good example of something really cool that Logan chose for the fake information. It definitely affected us. It didn't throw us like in the wrong direction. We still did what we were supposed to do. It made a fight harder, but only because of our own belief in something, even though we knew Cosmo had dubious knowledge. I think a little part of us knew that that could have been false information, but like the other information seemed real accurate, so he either critically succeeded, or it was dubious knowledge and something in it was wrong. So we just weren't sure what was going on there. And definitely I had someone get some dubious knowledge when I ran that exact same part, and I gave them information that just stated that they couldn't trust what they saw beyond a certain distance. So they were constantly second guessing everything that they saw in the distance. It was like, oh, was that an illusion? But it turned out that was not exactly correct. And it didn't really actually throw them off. They still went to the right way. So in general, you don't want to give false information when there's misleading or false information that is just going to derail you. And if you're running very improvisationally or a sandbox and nothing derails you and just sort of the plot can go where it wants to go, then maybe it can be okay to give almost anything for the false information. But other than that, you just want to make sure it's not something that throws you off. Whether or not it's like Linda said, it's just something silly, or like I said, it could be ultimately harmless. It's really up to you. So, let's see. We've talked about hidden information, its ultimate purpose in the game, when not to use it, and when to use it, as well as metagaming, the fact that we often define it way too strictly, and a few GM sleight of hand tips. So another GM sleight of hand tip that I think we did not mention yet, but bears mentioning because a lot of people do this, is just rolling a die roll randomly for no reason and refusing to explain it, or passing notes for no reason. That's more of the sleight of hand to avoid Chekhov's gun. Because whenever you pass a note, people might think, oh my gosh, this person's been replaced by a doppelganger every time, or something like that. But you could pass a note, just says, how are you doing? And the player says, oh, fine, and sends it back to you. And someone upstream, and I can look up to check, one of you guys was talking about using a chat program to do that, and I've definitely done that before. To give a good example from one of my home game one-shots, we had a one-shot where it was called Burn the Witch, wherein basically there was a cabin in the middle of the woods where, like, the three PCs were the constable, who was secretly having an affair with the Baron's daughter, and he had stashed her in the cabin in the middle of the woods because of the fact that she was an unknown person in the town and there was a big witch scare, and he wanted to make sure she didn't get caught up in the witch scare. Then there was a sort of the town shopkeeper who is the best friend of the constable, but is also secretly a major drug dealer who is a thorn in the constable's hide, and who used that one house in the woods from when he and the constable were growing up that no one else really remembers, and he's pretty sure the constable doesn't remember, to do meetings with his supplier. And there's this one little house in the woods where the third character, who is a fledgling witch but not the witch responsible for the crimes, was taught by her mentor. And so there's this one spot that everybody actually had secretly, and that they all didn't know was the exact same spot. And it turned out in that game that for whatever reason, and causing fits with the sheriff player a little bit, the player of the sort of the drug dealer, but the innkeeper, while they were exploring in the woods looking for clues of the witch, sent me a note that he was going to lead them to the cabin, sort of making it look like it's through accidental turns. And so I was telling the sheriff, oh, you keep getting closer and closer to the cabin, and he was sweating because, oh, they're going to find her. And he managed to divert the others and get the Baron's daughter out of there. And the group then found this empty cabin in the middle of the woods that was just there. Everyone was like, oh crap, how do we find this? That must have been very unlucky, except the player of the innkeeper. And then they started using it in sort of their plans, like so the sheriff made like a fake tip to himself to go to the cabin in the middle of the woods that he was going to use as an excuse to get out there and try to move the Baron's daughter again. But then the only people who saw it were him and the other two players who were on the investigation and some of his deputies. The other two players, the fake tip was like saying from the witch, oh yes, I'm going to come here to meet with the evil drug dealer. But the other two players were a witch and that drug dealer. So the drug dealer person's like, you know what, I'm going to actually come at that time that this fake tip says that I'm coming, because no one would think that I would. And also I'm just kind of curious because this looks like a note from the witch saying that she wants to meet with me. And then Linda said, oh, I don't think Linda was playing the other witch. I don't think the main witch is going to come to this, but I can pretend to be the witch they're looking for and meet with this drug dealer and see what the deal with the drug dealer is. So they all were secretly hiding and going to that spot. But we used a chat program when they were sending me things. So each of them thought, okay, I'm doing my secret thing right now, and other people are doing their own downtime. But really, all of the characters that were in this scene with three people, two of whom seemed to be played by me, were all the PCs, and I was just letting them respond, and then moving on to use their responses to talk to the other PCs, just with whatever they said. If they said something, I would just say, oh yes, the shadowy witch says, and it was whatever the other person had said to me. Kind of like the sort of the mind game where you win about at least half of your games of chess in a room with grandmasters by memorizing the moves that are played against you in half the games and just sort of pitting half the grandmasters against each other, but you act as the intermediary where you just do their own moves. If anyone's ever heard of that trick, it can be fun, and I know it's pretty famous enough that if you mention it, some people, oh yeah, I've heard about that. Well, similarly, that's what I was doing. I was just transmitting the moves of each player to each other player using hidden information, and they made it through the end of that encounter. Not all of them escaped and went away and didn't get captured, and thinking like, whoa, I was in this encounter with these other people, and I guess everyone who wasn't the sheriff knew that the sheriff was there. And they probably thought it was a sting where somehow the sheriff, or even just that they didn't realize the sheriff's tip was fake and thought, well, of course the sheriff was checking in on that tip. So Linda points out that if the PC has a secret, she likes to know both what it is and how they want it to be handled, and make sure that she's on the same page with the PC in regards to the other player's knowledge of the secret. And that she likes to know secrets in players' backstories. This is because Hidden Twig asked, what about players' secrets in their backstories? Should they explain to the GM? The GM is the world around you, so they kind of have to know. Otherwise, like Linda said earlier, I didn't see it, you as the GM might wind up contradicting the player's secret, so the player's secret isn't even correct at all. Like, let's say that the player was like, I'm secretly a vampire who is injured by holy water, and you could have had someone, like, throw water on the PCs to be like, fooey with you, but really, you as the GM knew that was holy water that they throw on everyone who enters the town to see if they're vampires, and the player didn't know that the water was holy water, and you didn't know that the player was the vampire, and it didn't work. So, you have to tell the GM. Otherwise, it's just going to cause there to be a problem down the line where the GM doesn't play out your secret correctly. The only way you could even possibly avoid telling the GM is if your game was a little bit more freeform and players were just making plot points. And that doesn't happen usually in Pathfinder, but maybe your group does, where just the players create some of the some of what's going on in the story. That happens more in indie games where there's more narrative control, but even then, it requires, like, you can't have as easy hidden information from the GM. Now, maybe you could come up with a secret that is so not connected to anything involving the GM, because everything that is involved in the secret is self-contained in the player's own headcanon. So maybe the player has created a new NPC who is a basic peasant and whose existence can't possibly throw off any intrigue, and the player's secret is that they owe a debt of like 50 gold pieces to that peasant for some reason, because the peasant did something for them earlier in life. So you probably could have a secret debt to a peasant that's not important to the plot out of a large group of other peasants. And I can't really think of a way that the GM would give information that was really, really off of that, unless you go to the Bank of Abadar and they're like, PC, because of your very strong credit rating, we are offering you this very lucrative deal. Although even then you could say, well, my credit rating's not as strong as you think. But maybe, I guess if you go to the Bank of Abadar and they offer you a lucrative deal because the GM assumes you have a good credit rating and didn't know you didn't, I can come up with something. The point is, you might as well tell the GM. There's not much reason not to. Now, there's just sometimes that players feel like maybe the GM is going to metagame against them. And as the GM, it can be hard sometimes. You're the same way with players that we were talking about this whole time. As the GM, you have to metagame against yourself all the time. You guys, I can't remember who said it. I think Elftaro said, you constantly, whenever you're playing any of the NPCs, you have to avoid using metagame information that the GM and the one who's sort of controlling all the events and all the world knows when that NPC doesn't know it. You have to get very good at doing that as the GM. Sometimes it can be too hard and you wind up using the metagame information even if you didn't intend to do so as the GM. So, however, even though that might be the case, it's just really important that players trust the GMs to do their best not to do that, because you're more likely for the GM to accidentally mess you up with the secret that you just never told them than you are for the GM to intentionally mess you up or mistakenly metagame and mess you up for a secret that you did tell them. So it's worth telling the GM your secrets. There's some things maybe you can keep from the GM. Like, if you want to keep a battle tactic that you've come up with from the GM that's not like a rules corner case that you're going to try to force them to rule in a certain way at some point, you could. Now, letting the GM know the new tactic that's not a rules corner case might let the GM tell you, oh yeah, you know, that tactic you just said, there's this reason that you might want to adjust it, because that thing you're trying to do wouldn't necessarily work for the following reason. So I still recommend, in general, just letting the GM in on your plans. Also, the GM could realize a lot of things that your characters would know about why that doesn't work. That they may just not have told you, but that is very, very relevant to the situation. Or they might be like, oh yeah, that's an amazing plan. Go for it. You could hold off the plan, though, because their reaction to the plan, at worst for you, it's going to be what I just said, which is you're like, okay, we've got this plan, and it's going to work, and the GM says, ooh, there's this thing I told you, that I didn't tell you, and now that you're there and you've already started, you've really committed, you've gotten into a fight with some creatures that have alerted the rest of the dungeon, and now, yeah, your plan to take care of this is not going to work. That can be much worse than knowing before you even started that the plan wasn't going to work. And ultimately, if you can't trust your GM to run the game fairly, you're going to have a lot more problems than just whether or not your plans and your plots and your schemes come across as much as you'd like to. And a good GM is going to make sure that if it would make sense and be fair for your plan and your scheme to be successful, and there's no countermeasure against it, that you succeed and you do something awesome and that it's fun. And it's going to make sure that you know everything your character should have known about what's going on with the plan. Alright, so Dark Swordsman says that they love working with the GM to add to the character's backstory. I highly recommend that. Just always when my players want to do something with their backstory and maybe it's not fully defined, I talk to them about it and try to get them even more interwoven. Like in War for the Crown, one of the players is like, I want to be a noble who just is at odds with his family, and his family are kind of jerks, and he likes the common folk. I was like, well, what if you were a member of this family? It's going to show up in the adventure, and you can kind of be real mean to the other people in your own family. And he was like, okay, yeah, that fits my backstory and the class I wanted to play, since a lot of them are wizards. So then it worked out really well. So working together with your GM, or if you're the GM, working together with your players, teach them that they can trust you to make things cooler and to make things the way that the PCs want by making them cooler and making them the way that they want when they come to you. And they'll quickly learn that coming to you just makes it more fun for them. Whereas if every time they come to you, you don't tell them the problem with their plan, but then suddenly the NPCs realize that that the PCs plan to like create a water stream and use like a wave push and then summon a shark and have it come over. Oh no! The NPCs had shark insurance, and they put shark repellent up on the top of their walls in their land-bound fort. Then the PCs are going to learn that they can't trust you to find out about their plan, because why did they put shark repellent there? This is assuming that, of course, the enemies weren't scouting on the PCs. Yet another reason the PCs kind of should tell you what they're talking about is they don't know if there are divination effects. There have definitely been published adventure paths, including a very prominent one, where you might have a magic item that lets the main enemy spy on you like the entire time. And in that case, it's very important that that main enemy actually does know what you're planning. Not going to come into effect till later on, perhaps, but still, you didn't know that they were watching you, and so it can be a little awkward for the GM to say, well, no, you really have to tell me about this plan. They're like, why? It's something we're just doing quietly amongst ourselves. What? Is someone scrying on us right now? So if it's just more of a collaborative and sort of group effort, I think that it can help. You sort of use hidden information where it assists the game, and try to keep it more that the GM is hiding the information, and maybe the player and the GM together are hiding it from the other players. That's totally fine. But don't hide the information from the GM, because the GM has to be able to fairly adjudicate the results of the world on what the characters are doing. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.